Atul, as a visitor from the States and someone who's written a lot about the industry and observed growth in a lot of different regions, what are your sort of key takeaways from spending a couple of days looking at what was going on in Sao Paulo and now a day listening to BRASSCOM in Rio?
Right. So I've been coming here since 1998 for business, and I think the key thing that's happened is that as companies have managed to outsource their U.S. operations, they're looking at their Latin American operations and saying we ought to be doing the same thing. And I think that's where Brazil figures first. Secondly, where it's figuring it, there are some companies in Brazil that have much bigger dreams. And so they're going after the U.S. market. They, of course, have challenges because of that. Part of that is the appreciation of the currency. The other thing is the cost structure is higher. At the same time, I think what's happened is that as Accenture, IBM, TCS, and others have expanded, they've come to realize that there is actually a Brazilian market. So, for example, Itaú is the ninth highest capitalized market cap bank in the world. I mean, so all of a sudden you have a Brazilian company that's a top 10 bank. And so TCS and Accenture will be interested in that. So I think you're seeing a number of different things. You're seeing the Brazilian labor pool being leveraged. You're seeing the domestic market attracting companies, but the market definitely has challenges, even though it is definitely one of the rising economies.
Okay, and I heard that quite clearly one of the things that we've been talking about over the past few days is that Brazil can't compete on cost with a lot of other regions, and but somebody stood up in the conference earlier today and said. Almost directly, how can you compete? You're not India, you're not China. How are you going to specialize? I mean, have you seen that there is a move to specialize in particular services?
Right. So I think, first of all, it's important to recognize that not every client makes a decision purely on cost. So what clients will do is they'll optimize a decision looking at factors like risk, control, quality, and cost. And for some, the risk and control could simply be a geographic distance or could be time zone. Right, so I think that's one. So you will have some clients who will make a decision to stay in the same time zone because that matters to them. They feel they can collaborate a lot better than they can when the time zones are 12 hours apart. Secondly, while it may be higher cost, but the reason they're able to compete is in some sectors, let's take bank, for example. Let's take inflation, for example. Brazilian banks know how to deal with inflation. And what I mean by that, it's not just about the fact that the central bank can manage inflation. It's much more about when banks have to deal in an high inflation environment, they know how to manage their banking system to do that. If you were looking for that expertise, you don't want to go to India. You want to look at Brazil. And so, and then agribusiness, green energy, I think very soon oil and gas. So I think there's some sectors also where you will find expertise in Brazil that you may not easily find somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that's a good point as well. Clearly. This is not just about the offshoring IT and comparison of costs. There's markets here like green energy, for example. I mean, as you just mentioned, what other country in the world can you get a mix? You can mix gas and alcohol in your car, and you can just choose which fuel you want to use.
Right.
I mean, the market itself is very strong. You mentioned about Itaú, but. And so most of the IT companies have grown up focused on serving the domestic market, which seems very similar to China, actually.
Right.
How do you think that they are going to switch to an export focus, and is it already happening?
So I think that's the challenge of a rising economy. And I think the challenge of a rising economy is that there's plenty of business to be had within the country, and so firms tend to go after what's easy. And I think the only way firms, particularly Brazilian firms, will focus on business outside Brazil is if a customer drives it, and I think it'll happen. So in a bank like Itaú, it's not just in Brazil, but in 9 countries plus. Some of these suppliers will follow the client to do it. The second is the government incentives. If the government values the sector, they will provide incentives to improve exports. And that would be the other reason that would drive some of these companies to focus on the market outside of Brazil.
And a lot of people have mentioned the question about Portuguese being the main language here. I know that I've spoken to a couple of American buyers of services who have said, you know, I really like the Brazil model. There seems to be a lot more productivity than the technical guys they've got in Asia, but they just struggle to get their head around working with a team in Portuguese. So do you think that it'll be will that hinder the indigenous IT firms from developing further, or will there still be a strong development through the multinationals who are building up resource here?
So, if you look at China, for example, the Chinese IT market to a large extent is not necessarily the domestic Chinese organizations, it's the multinational operations in China that are leveraging a lot of these companies. I think with Brazil becoming a major economy and a good growth rate, you'll probably see something similar. So I think that'll definitely help. Those multinational Brazilian operations will leverage these companies. Other than that, so the challenge Brazilian firms have, from an English perspective, is scale. But if they're trying to put 100 people or 200 people together for a company, or even 600 for that matter, it's not a challenge. And I think there's enough English being studied. And then if you go down south, you find Italian and German and others. But there's enough that they're able to serve multinational customers even outside of Brazil. But I think the challenge with the lack of English would be is just scale. If you're looking to hire 2,000 people, that might be a challenge.
Mm. And one of the things I noticed today was one of the Brazilian tech firms talking about they're pushing very heavily into the healthcare sector. And clearly we can see expertise in the environmental sector here as well. And I mean, there's also sectors like security that are clearly going to grow as well. Do you think that the adaptability, I mean, the clear sort of flexibility of the market here may well actually help these guys in the sort of mid to long term compared to, say, more established IT markets?
So, in the long run, the labor arbitrage game will continue, but in the long run, companies will need to have domain expertise to become long-term partners with their client base. And I think this is where a significantly mature sector. So, for example, having the 9th most valuable bank in the world, having expertise like we talked about regarding dealing with inflation. When you talk about the green energy and utility, the massive agribusiness that exists in Brazil, the developing oil and gas sector, I think those things will definitely help. Now, it doesn't mean they won't have competition because those similar sectors happen to be developing in other areas also. But combining that with some other unique areas, like, for example, we find some very good SAP, and also we find some very good open source skills because the government has been very supportive of open source in Brazil. And I think you put those two together, and I think you finally have an advantage that is truly competitive.
So I guess, I mean, just in summary then, it seems positive. It seems as if there is a different emphasis on both business domains and even technical domains like open source. What would you say needs to happen to make it work as BRASSCOM plans?
I think I'm very optimistic about Brazil. And I'm impressed with the quality of the firms in Brazil and the labor force in Brazil. My recommendation of BRASSCOM is to continue to focus on the education, so the labor force continues to be of high quality, and the second would be incentives. Let's make sure that exports are incentivized, so these companies are more attractive to multinational buyers that are wanting to use maybe the nearshore or an offshore strategy that involves Brazil.